It's 1952, and an Oxford student by the name of Red Rupert looks down from his poster of Lenin to his ringing phone. Suspecting he knows what this is about, he answers. Red Rupert's media magnate father Keith has died from cancer. Immediately, a 21-year-old Rupert returns home to Australia to deal with the fallout. For someone who goes by the name Red Rupert, he hates the estate tax as he's forced to sell his father's shares in the Herald to pay death duties. The remnant of his father's empire is now much smaller, but crucially, Rupert holds on to the parent company of many smaller newspapers, News Limited. For Red Rupert, two things were clear. One, after those nasty death duties, never again would he fall into the traps of socialist thought, and two, he was going to build News Limited to be so big that it would outdo the Roman Empire for power. Except unlike the Romans, Commodus was actually going to outdo Marcus Aurelius. This is the story of how one man built an empire that neither dominated the land nor the seas, but the minds of all of us.
Let me add one thing about Rupert Murdoch, though, that to picture him as some one-dimensional figure is a great mistake.
So what happens in this country, Australia, is that politicians, left and right, corporates, academics, universities, not-for-profits, no one actually debates in this country the Murdoch media monopoly.
So yes, I did say all of us. Like me, you might not actually tune into any particular News Corp outlet, well, at least since Bill O'Reilly went down, but that doesn't matter. I'm going to argue that Murdoch's influence isn't in the slant of his commentary, but rather in setting the agenda of what the news actually is. This video is also the brainchild of our wonderful patron Will. If you want to see me cover a topic, it is a perk accessible to all our Year 12 patrons and has been responsible for these videos. But to properly understand News Corp, we've got to go back to Murdoch's father, Keith. Now, Keith Murdoch was actually a journalist who largely came to fame covering World War I, and in fact at one point actually was engaged to the daughter of the future Prime Minister of Britain, Bonar Law. I should do an alternate history on if that marriage actually went ahead. Afterwards, Keith Murdoch was made chief editor of the Melbourne Herald, and from there he bought the Adelaide News and the Brisbane Courier. Arguably, Murdoch's real power came from his relationships with key politicians. For instance, he was a keen supporter of Joseph Lyon's breakaway from the Labor Party to form the United Australia Party. Not that UAP, a different UAP, I've got a whole YouTube series where I cover it. For his efforts, Lyon's successor, Robert Menzies, created a new job for him during World War II. This was the Director General of Information. Effectively, Murdoch had the power to force all media outlets to publish government statements, and many actually likened him to Goebbels. However, Robert Menzies was in a minority government and relied on independents to form a majority. During the war, these independents flipped to John Curtin's Labor government. As a result, Murdoch lost his job and returned to the papers, of course being a vehement critic of Curtin. When Murdoch died, the Herald exercised its right to buy Murdoch's Courier shares, and as Rupert had to sell his Herald shares to pay death duties, that left him with just the Adelaide News. From here, Murdoch would conquer the world. So one of the ways that Rupert was extremely different to his father was that he was adamant that he not just managed news outlets, but owned them. And so to it, he went on a purchasing spree buying struggling papers from across all the states like the Sunday Times in Perth and the Daily Mirror in Sydney, as well as others in Queensland, Victoria and the Northern Territory. However, it was 1964 when Murdoch launched his own paper, The Australian, one my Aussie viewers would be very familiar with today. But given the size of this paper, it's easy to forget that this wasn't expected to work whatsoever. Australia was still a fairly recent concept, and any important national news would still get covered in the more local Sydney and Melbourne papers. The idea of an Australian would kind of feel as broad as, say, Euronews, and many tipped it for failure for ripping out the heart of local journalism. Now, they were kind of actually right. For decades, really until the mid-80s, the Australian ran at a loss and hurt News Limited's profit margins. But Murdoch didn't care. He was in the empire business rather than the wealth business, and the Australian was a vital tool in influencing elections, such as 1972. So from 1949 until the early 70s, Australia was continually under the control of the Liberal Party. For most of that time, they were led by the guy we met before, Robert Menzies. Essentially, after World War II, he rebranded the UAP to become the Liberal Party and then defeated Ben Chifley. To form a majority, the Liberals needed to govern in coalition with the Country Party, and it was these guys who Murdoch's papers mostly supported, as he was a keen ally of the leader, John McEwen. This put Murdoch in a strange position. He supported the minority party in the majority government and was therefore open to taking down the Liberals if the opportunity came up. And so it did in 1972. You see, Menzies was replaced by Harold Holt, who drowned, or was taken by a Chinese submarine never to be seen again. You don't have the proof to prove otherwise. And so John Gordon replaced Harold Holt, but then he stood down for Billy McMahon. In opposition was the reformist Gough Whitlam, who campaigned on revolutionary policy like Medicare and free uni, and so Murdoch decided to throw his weight behind Whitlam's It's Time campaign. When Whitlam won, Murdoch believed that he was indebted to him. Whitlam thought otherwise and repeatedly blew off meetings with Murdoch, and so to it, just like that, Murdoch then turned on him. In a declassified US telegram, the US Consul General in Melbourne reported that Murdoch ordered his editors to quote-unquote kill Whitlam. This sentiment is also supported by one of Murdoch's former managers, John Menadue, who also added that Murdoch felt betrayed that Whitlam didn't offer him the role of High Commissioner in London. Whatever the detail, Murdoch's papers certainly went after Whitlam, and it'd be far from the last time that Labor fell into his crosshairs. In 1972, Whitlam also purchased the Daily Telegraph off of Frank Packer, who was succeeded by Murdoch's new rival, Kerry Packer. Pitted against each other, they'd come to dominate the Australian media, and Frank Packer would later write of his regret of selling to Murdoch. On top of that, Packer's lawyer was a young Malcolm Turnbull, who would also end up going after Murdoch as he voiced his support for a royal commission into his media monopoly decades later. But despite their personal rivalry, Packer and Murdoch both largely pushed an agenda that was favourable to big business and certainly had disdain for unions. As a result, the Labor Party had to play ball with both of these tycoons, and Hawke's government of the 80s was much more pro-corporate than Whitlam's of the 70s. Now, this was despite Hawke having previously been president of the Australian Council of Trade Unions. Hawke's maverick deputy and eventual successor Paul Keating had a huge public bust-up with Packer over Packer endorsing his opponent John Howard, but kept somewhat good relations with Murdoch. This was because back in 1986, while serving in Hawke's cabinet, Keating introduced cross-media ownership laws which allowed media dominance if confined to just the one medium. The theory was that with the rise of the screen, real media diversity wasn't limited to the papers. This enabled Murdoch to then buy the Herald and Weekly Times in 1987. What this meant was that he had a near total monopoly in Adelaide, Brisbane and Hobart, and now a strong foothold in both Melbourne and Sydney. But here's the thing. For us Aussies, we of course know both Murdoch and Packer, but I'm willing to guess all of you Yanks have never heard of Packer. However, you've absolutely heard of Murdoch. That's because Murdoch dared to cross the Rubicon and enter America. Now, if this video is coming across as though I like Murdoch, let me assure you I don't. I think the world is net worse for having had Murdoch in it, and I'm speaking in past tense just in case he dies before I upload this. But I can't say that what he did wasn't impressive. So Murdoch's first foray outside of Australia came in 1964 when he bought the Dominion, a Wellington newspaper in New Zealand. A decade later, he moved to New York and bought his first American paper, the San Antonio Express. Again, he was severely underestimated. Murdoch had come to control Australia by beginning in Adelaide of all places, and was ready to do it once again from San Antonio. However, with running papers like The Australian at a loss, there was simply no way that Murdoch could just buy his way into the market, and he needed a revenue maker. This would be the start. You see, rather than engage in the dull drudgery of politics, real money could be made in celebrity gossip, and basically being the TMZ of the 70s. What this meant was that in 1976 he could purchase ownership of the historic New York Post for $30 million. Now, from a purely monetary point of view, this was nonsensical as the Post had just suffered a $500,000 loss in the previous financial year, and has since never made profit due to the decline of afternoon dailies. But this was a hugely symbolic move. The Post had been a part of American society since being introduced by Hamilton of all people, and the message was clear. Murdoch was a rising player in the US market. And of course, Murdoch didn't stop there. The next move that he made was a $255 million purchase of 50% of TCF stock. TCF being short for 20th Century Fox. Long story short, one of Fox's two major shareholders fled to Switzerland after being charged for illegally trading with Iran. The other major shareholder bought this stock on the cheap, resold it to Murdoch for double, and then Murdoch bought the remaining stake off of him for $325 million in 1984. So as the new owner of Fox, Murdoch decided that the 80s was prime time to go headfirst into the TV game, beginning Fox Broadcasting. In a pre-streaming era, gaining traction for a new show was hard enough, let alone gaining traction for an entire new channel. One of Fox's first headline shows was The Late Show starring Joan Rivers, but this was about as successful as the US In-Betweeners, and she couldn't compete with her mentor, Johnny Carson. Instead, if Fox was going to be successful, it needed original material. And Murdoch took a gamble on a show you might be familiar with, The Simpsons. Immediately, this became a roaring success, with it being Fox's first show to crack the Nielsen Top 30. In fact, it became so successful that Fox even moved it from Sunday at 8 PM to Thursday at 8 PM to compete with America's most popular show, The Cosby Show. By the end of the 80s, Fox was well and truly off the ground. But for Murdoch, Fox brought a huge legal issue. The FCC, short for Federal Communications Commission, and technically an arm of the president, had a rule that in the interest of avoiding media monopolies, no one was allowed to own both a paper and a television station in the same market. It was echoing the same concern that Keating had about monopolies across multiple mediums. And so it was extremely black and white. Murdoch was in violation of this rule by owning both the New York Post and the WNYW, Fox's New York station. But for President Reagan, this was a tricky one. The New York Post had been really important in giving him a landslide win over Jimmy Carter, and his commission was now putting Murdoch at risk of needing to sell it. So the FCC commissioners are nominated by the president and approved by the Senate. Reagan and the Senate came to an agreement to let the FCC give Murdoch a temporary 2-year waiver on the rule to find a purchaser for the New York Post. He sold it in 1988 for $37.5 million, but when the FCC gave Murdoch a permanent waiver in 1993, he repurchased it. This part of the story is wild. So this guy, Mario Cuomo, father to Chris and Andrew, was governor of New York and relied on the New York Post's favourable coverage. Since the 1988 sale, it was destined to go under, and so in an effort to save the paper, he persuaded the FCC to give Murdoch an exemption to save a historic paper. I should also add that Murdoch gained US citizenship to enable him to legally own his US empire now. But wait, I've discussed Murdoch and Fox and the FCC, however I've missed the best bit, Fox News. So during the 80s, the big news network was of course CNN. CNN was owned by this guy, Ted Turner. Now, like with Packer, Murdoch grew to have a huge feud with Turner, but the origins of this story are so much more funny. During the Sydney to Hobart, Australia's biggest yacht race, Murdoch's sponsored yacht rammed into the yacht that Turner was skippering, forcing it to run aground 10 k's from the finish line. After giving Murdoch a spray, Murdoch then challenged him to a televised fight in Vegas. Zuck and Elon really are showing that Solomon was right. There is absolutely nothing new under the sun. Now, by the 80s, Murdoch's beliefs were hardening further towards deregulation. For instance, he was a supporter of both Thatcher and Reagan, but that simply wasn't sexy and didn't energise people. What did in fact energise people were the culture wars and tacking social conservatism to deregulation. With CNN having a somewhat culturally liberal slant, Murdoch saw a huge gap in the market for a socially conservative channel. Of course, now that Murdoch owned Fox, enter Fox News. Murdoch talked Roger Allies, a former MSNBC guy and strategist for Richard Nixon, into becoming the CEO of Fox News, and soon after in 1996 landed one of its biggest hosts, Bill O'Reilly.
Do it live! I'll write it and we'll do it live!
But before I get to the present day, there is still more to the story. So back in 1981, Murdoch, who already owned The Sun by this point, expanded further into Britain by purchasing The Times and Sunday Times. As Murdoch was a keen supporter of Thatcher, her government made no referral to the Monopolies and Mergers Commission. So this company right here, British Satellite Broadcasting, was an 80s version of cable in Britain, and Murdoch wanted his channels to be included. This request was denied, and so Murdoch started his own cable network called Sky and incorporated the BSB into his network. Sky became so powerful that its huge TV rights deal led the top division of English football to break away from the Football League to become the FA Premier League. If you're not a football fan, they only really measure stats from the 1992 split onwards. So for Sky to be the driving company behind this was huge. Can you see how many tentacles Murdoch had spread by this point? But when it came to football, it didn't just stop there, as Murdoch made a failed bid to buy Manchester United. United fans, let me know, Murdoch or the Glazers. Also, like the video if you think Rupert Mannion from Ted Lasso is in fact a reference to Rupert Murdoch. My colleague thinks I'm paranoid. As Murdoch was now firmly entrenched in Britain, he had considerable sway over the elections, and just like he did with Hawke, made UK Labour much more deregulatory in exchange for support. From 1997 to 2005, Murdoch's papers were either somewhat neutral or very pro-Tony Blair. Keating also gave Blair the advice that Murdoch only responds to strength. Murdoch also brought Sky back down under, and in 1996 launched Sky News. It followed the pattern of Fox News of being 24 hours with some editorial segments, and over time became the extremely neutral outlet that we all know and love. Now, in the early 2000s, Murdoch made a number of other moves, such as increasing his NFL coverage, but there's no need to labour the point that by the 2000s, he was a powerhouse in the media. I'm instead going to skip ahead to 2011 because as a 13-year-old, this was when I first heard of Rupert Murdoch. Before then, I never knew who that guy in The Simpsons was supposed to be. The 2011 story that brought Murdoch into my consciousness was, of course, the phone hacking scandal. Now, for some years before this point, it was known that Murdoch's UK newspaper, News of the World, had hacked phones to access things like voicemails from celebrities and athletes. Now, up until this point, the narrative was that this was done inadvertently and that private investigators hired by News of the World simply went rogue. But In December of 2010, The Guardian released documents that showed that the News of the World editor, Ian Edmondson, actually instructed the PI to hack a phone. This then led to a police investigation and parliamentary inquiry in which Murdoch himself appeared to give testimony. As more cases of hacking emerged, including of murder victims and London bombing victims, Murdoch was asked if he held any responsibility. Murdoch's answer was simple: no. I trusted the wrong people, and they covered it up from me. This led to some high-profile resignations, including his son James, who resigned from News of the World but not News Corp more broadly. Advertisers then pulled out of News of the World, which caused it to go defunct in 2011. Later in 2013, Channel 4 published a secret recording obtained from The Sun, in which Murdoch said that the investigation was a sham and promised to take care of journalists sent to prison. And so throughout the 2010s, as Murdoch moved closer to his death, he started to plan for his succession. So after a series of mergers and splits, his two main babies were News Corp and 21st Century Fox. Just last month, so September of 2023, Murdoch resigned as executive chairman from both of these organisations. His son Lachlan was to take over his father's role in both of these capacities, with Lachlan, James and their sister Elizabeth sharing the ownership. It's pretty safe to assume that Lachlan will make a play to buy the rest of the ownership off of his siblings. Though the phone hacking affair damaged James, that wasn't actually the thing that sunk him. When Disney bought 21st Century Fox in 2019, he was let go as CEO of Fox, and then in 2020, he resigned from the board of directors of News Corp over differences in their coverage. It appeared that James had less of a Trumpian vision compared to where Fox was going. Now, Rupert has often spoken of Lachlan's support of freedom, which translates to deregulation. But regarding potential support for Donald Trump, it's really hard to say. For their stolen election narrative of 2020, Dominion Voting Systems sued them for making false statements about their voting machines. Fox acknowledged these false statements and paid $787 million in damages. This was over half a year of Fox News' profits. Rupert's prior support of Trump was as much a marketing decision as it was an ideological one, but now that tap's run pretty dry for Fox. Regarding Australia, for the last decade, Murdoch's been a keen supporter of the Liberal Party. News Corp outlets were especially vocal behind Abbott in 2013 and Morrison in 2019, with a little more hesitance about Turnbull in 2016 and Morrison again in 2022. With one of their guys, Peter Dutton, now in party leadership once again, I think we can expect Lachlan to continue to wave the blue banner, but it's not as though no one's tried to stop Murdoch in Australia. After Murdoch surprisingly went for Labor in 2007, Kevin Rudd moved to introduce a national broadband network which would threaten the home base of the empire. Murdoch then turned on Rudd, and coincidentally he was taken out at the same time. Then, years afterwards, Rudd, alongside Packer's old lawyer Turnbull, called for a royal commission into the Murdoch monopoly, specifically targeting his predatory practices of buying small regional papers in Queensland and then scrapping them to remove the competition. You can learn all about the origins of that feud by clicking here to watch this video on Rudd.